So this series is called Divine Communication. Divine Communication. You know, it's been said that the most valuable skill that you could ever develop is the skill of communication. Forbes magazine not long ago had a long article talking about the number one problem in the workforce is a lack of communication. Marriage experts tell us the number one problem in marriage is a lack of good communication. And I can tell you that for us as believers, as Christians, one of the weaknesses in our life is a lack of communication with our own God. Because when it comes to communication, it's able to just relate, to communicate with other people, and it's the value in our lives of understanding that brings success into our lives. Do you realize that when you are speaking to someone, it's your words that become so powerful that repel someone or pull someone into you? But it's not just the weight of the words in which you speak, but it is the emotion behind the words in which you speak. Because many times you can talk to someone and it's just an attitude of apathy, or you can talk to someone who is passionate and exciting, and that's the person that you want to be around. And there is a huge difference in the way that we communicate. It was in ancient Greece. They were masters when it came to communication. They built gigantic amphitheaters, would fill those stadiums full where people would come in for entertainment, and they were skilled as they stood on that stage. And they were actors, performers, and orators, and singers, but very, very skilled at communicating words and songs. The Greeks said that there are three things that you must have to be a great communicator. The first one is logos, which means word. It's your content. That if someone is going to stand on a stage before you and speak, then they must have substance if they're worth listening to. The second Greek word is ethos. It's where we get our word ethics, and where someone speaks something on stage and then they live opposite of that off stage, then that person is not even worth listening to. The third word is pathos. It's where we get our word passion. It's that great conviction that we have. It's pathos. It's that strong emotion that is barely able to be controlled. What I want to talk to you about for the next few moments is the pathos level of communication. And I want to draw your attention to John chapter 11, starting with verse 17. Now, this is a rather lengthy passage, so I have skipped several verses, so it doesn't take so long, but you can still get the picture of what it's all about. John chapter 11, verse 17. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the grave for 4 days. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now, here's his response to her in verse 25. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life, and the one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? It was a little while later that Mary now hears that Jesus is on the outskirts of the town. She gets up and she goes out to find him in verse 32. And Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, and she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And when Jesus saw her weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Jesus wept. And then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believed, that you would see the glory of God? And his response to her in verse 43, and Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. When I read this story, what I find so difficult to understand is how that these two ladies, Mary and Martha, made the same statement. If you'll look on the screen at verse 21, here you see Martha who says to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. In verse 32, Mary says to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. If you notice, these are the exact same statements. It is the exact identical words that they speak, and yet Jesus responds to them in such a different way. What you find here in this story is that Jesus gives Martha a sermon about the end times, where Mary asks the very same thing, the very same words, and she receives a touch from God and a miracle from God on that very day. Same words, but different response. What I'm having a hard time understanding this morning is when there is such great difficulty and pain in the lives of people, and someone sitting in the stadium seating who is in great, great need, and there is a cry that comes out of them, "I need you, Jesus." How is that cry different than someone sitting on the front row that has the very same cry, "I need you, Jesus"? How is it that someone's life is falling apart and they just call out during the service at some point saying, "God, help me," on the 11th row, but that call of help be different than someone on the 3rd row that calls out and says, "God, I need your help"? How can it be so different? How can we stand in a worship service like we did a few moments ago, two people standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder, and one, as they are singing the song, tears are streaming down their face, and they sense something, they feel the presence of God, and at that moment, they are touched by God, they are experiencing a transformation, a healing, a miracle. It's in that moment that they will remember for the rest of their lives. It is so dynamic. But the person standing right next to them, singing the same song, the same words, is so unmoved, bored out of their minds, wondering when this service will be over so I can sit down, receiving absolutely nothing. Same song, same words. One remains spiritually barren, and the other one is touched by God. And the answer to that is that one entered into the pathos level, one addressing God in mediocrity, while the other one is addressing God with passion. Because what you must understand this morning is that the ear of God is tuned to those who are hurting. It was many years ago when our children were young. Kay and I invited one of our church interns who was a college student to come over and have dinner with us. We loved him. He was phenomenal. And so we were having a great time. After dinner, we dismissed our kids, and they ran away from the table back to the back room to play. The three of us stayed at the table, and we just stayed behind, and we were eating dessert and drinking coffee, enjoying our conversation. When all of a sudden, from the back room where the kids were playing, there was a loud scream, a loud cry, and at that moment, the intern, the young college student, came up out of his seat with a panicked look on his face, and Kay and I didn't flinch, we didn't move, and I just said, "It's okay, sit down, it's all right. That was just my brother hit me cry. They'll be okay, just calm down." So he sat down. It was a little while later that there was another loud cry that came out of the back bedroom. And again, he came up out of his seat with that panicked look on his face. And Kay and I, we didn't flinch. We didn't budge. And I said, "It's okay. Sit down. Sit down. That was just, I saw a spider scream. They'll get a shoe and kill it. They'll be okay." A little while later, there was another loud cry that came from the bedroom. And this time, he just sat calmly. But this time, Kay and I, we came up out of our seats, knocking the chairs over, running to the back room, and I was saying, "That's a hurt cry." As a father, if I can discern the cry of my own children, how much more can a heavenly Father discern the cry that comes out of you in a time of devastation? What I understand is that there are many people sitting in this auditorium today that are going through the battle of their life. The pain, the devastation, the tragedy. When you think about what people are going through, and when you find out that your spouse has had an affair, when you find out or you receive a call in the middle of the night that there's been a family tragedy and someone has died. It's when you go to work in the place that you've worked for 20 long years and you walk in and they tell you that today's your last day and there's no severance pay. It's when you go to the doctor and he sits down in front of you and he shakes his head and he says, you have stage 4 cancer and there's nothing that we can do. It's when you get the eviction notice and that you're going to be removed out of your house and you have no place to go. It's when your child rebels and it's created such turmoil in your home and you don't know what to do. It's when the doctor tells you that your child, your little baby, has a disease and will never live a normal life. And it's when those devastations hit, and they hit so hard and so strong that it takes your breath away and that you can't even breathe. It's at that moment, and some of you know what I'm talking about, that is so severe and it's so deep that you can't even get a prayer out, that you don't even know how to pray, and there is nothing that comes out of you but a moan. There is nothing that will come out of you, but there is just a cry, and the cry is nothing more of saying, I just need Jesus. And what that cry is, it's the cry of pathos. It's the cry of passion, and the ear of God is tuned to that. I want to explain what passion is. Passion is a word that comes from the Latin. When you look up passion in the Webster Dictionary, listen to how it's described. It's defined in the Webster Dictionary as the suffering and the death of Christ. That is powerful, because passion is what drove Jesus to go through the suffering, shedding his blood, dying a brutal death on a cross. That he went through all of that because he had such a deep passion and a love for you, that he was willing to be driven by the passion to bring you redemption, salvation, renewal, healing, miracle, and eternal life, driven by the passion of all of that. It's the reason why Mel Gibson called the movie The Passion of the Christ, because passion is what drove Jesus to go through the suffering and to go through the death. In the book of James, in James chapter 5 and verse 13, here James asks a question and he says, is any among you suffering? That's the question for us this morning. How many of you are in this room and you're suffering? And he goes on and he says, then let him pray. In verse 16, the effective, fervent prayer. And when I read that word, the effective, that catches my attention. Because when I pray, I want my prayers to be effective. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. And if some prayers are effective, we must assume that there are some prayers that are ineffective. In the next verse, in verse 17, and Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. Elijah in the Old Testament, who saw the magnificent miracles of God flowing through his life. There wasn't anything special about Elijah. The Bible says that he was a mere man, just like all of us. And it goes on and says, and he prayed earnestly. Another translation says, and he prayed passionately. And here you find that the effective prayer is a fervent prayer. The effective prayer is a passionate prayer. It makes me think of King David in the Bible, and where David was called a man after God's own heart. Who wouldn't want to be called that? But David was not called that because he was sinless. When you read the entirety of David's life, David probably sinned more than all of us in this room. And yet God labeled him as a man after his own heart. And here's the reason why. When you read all of the Psalms, you read all of David's writings, what you find is that he had such an unusual and a unique passion for God you rarely ever see. It was the passion that connected him to his God. The disciples on one occasion, they had followed Jesus and they had watched Jesus pray. They realized that Jesus had this amazing connection between he and his Father in heaven. There was one day that they stopped him and they said, Jesus, teach us to pray like you pray. Teach us how to pray. And here it is. Here's the big answer that Jesus gives. You find it in Luke chapter 11. in verse 5, and he tells it in a parable. And he says, suppose you have a friend, and you go to the friend because you're in need of 3 loaves of bread. You have company that has shown up. You have nothing to feed them. So you go to the friend's house, and it's at the midnight hour, and you knock on the door saying, hey, open up the door. I need 3 loaves of bread. But the one who is on the inside of the house says, get out of here, go away, leave me alone, because it's midnight, I'm in bed, my wife is in bed, our kids are in bed, I'm not getting up and disturbing everyone in the middle of the night, no way, no how, go away. But Jesus goes on and says, but the man on the outside continues to knock. And he knocks, and he knocks. And then you find in verse 8, and it says, and I tell you that even though he will not get up and give him anything because he is a friend, at least because of his persistence, he will get up and give him whatever he needs. So the man receives what he needs, not because the man on the inside loves him or cares for him, but it is simply because of a passionate persistence. Then I want you to flip over to Luke chapter 18, and Jesus tells the same parable, but he just simply changes the characters in the story. Now he starts off, and here in this story, he says, and suppose there was a widow who was being harassed by someone in the village, that he was causing her deep problems, severe issues. She needed help desperately. This man was going to ruin her life. And so she goes to the local judge. And she knocks on the door, and she begs for his help, and he refuses to help her. He doesn't care about her. She's a woman. She is poor. She can do nothing for him. He doesn't have a desire to help her and tells her to go away. But she stands and she knocks and she knocks and she knocks and she will not give up. And in verse 5 in the parable, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by continually coming. Seriously? That's how Jesus describes how we are to pray? But every parable that Jesus told, there's always a twist to the story. The parables in which Jesus told always seem to have some type of shock value attached to it. Because just as the disciples, we do the very same thing. When you hear the parable, you try to figure out, okay, how do I fit into the story? Because I've got to be someone and God's got to be someone. And you look at the first story and you think, okay, I must be the guy that is in need of the 3 loaves of bread sitting on the outside. And God must be the one on the inside unwilling to help. When you think about the rest of the other part of the story, you find that I must be the widow and Jesus or our God must be the grumpy old judge on the inside, unwilling to help me. And when you look at that, it makes you shake your head and think, is that really how God sees us? But again, the parable is always to cause you to stop, shake your head, think, what in the world is he saying? You ponder it, but Jesus wasn't comparing God to an irritable friend or to an unjust judge, but he was drawing a contrast. And listen to what he says. He says, if an unwilling friend or a grumpy old judge will give you what you need because of your passionate, persistent asking, how much more will a God who loves you and cares about you and who created you, when you come to him with a passionate, persistent, will he give you everything that you need in life? You know, it's a strange thing how that the storms of life cause us to all of a sudden become passionate towards God. It was December the 26th, 2004, that the largest earthquake that has ever been recorded took place deep in the Indian Ocean. 9.2 magnitude. When that earthquake took place, it created a tsunami, and it started moving toward land. The tsunami was traveling at 600 miles an hour. 2 hours before that, there was just a group of tourists that boarded a boat. They were going out on a recreational dive. They'd gone out not too far from the shore, and there the dive master got all of these inexperienced divers into the water, 13 of them, and now they had gone underneath, and they were now diving at about 40 feet, and they were thoroughly enjoying themselves when the dive master noticed something strange. That out in front of him were the fish that were acting very erratically and darting back and forth in a way that he had never seen fish act before. Then he said, all of a sudden, every fish in front of him turned their noses down and dove immediately deep into the water. He said, I had no idea what was coming, no idea what was happening, but I knew that they sensed danger. And I pointed to all 13 around me, pointed down, follow me. And he said, I took them as deep as we could possibly go. He said, all of a sudden, we were hit with this strong current, and everything went dark at that moment. A few moments later, all 13 came up and surfaced and survived. As they surfaced the water, they looked toward the land, and they saw this gigantic wave at that moment hitting land, destroying and wiping out everything in its path. And on that day, it killed 280,000 people. In the interview with the dive master, they were talking to him about how they survived. And he said, the only reason that we're alive today is because we went deep. He said, the safest place to be in a tsunami is to be deep in the water. When the tsunami of life hits us, you got to go deep. You got to go deep. You got to go as deep as you can possibly go. When the tsunami of life strikes you, when it strikes your marriage or your job or your finances or your children, what you have to do is you have to get off of the surface where all of the wind and the waves and the debris that is able to destroy you, that you're able to go deep enough, that you go so deep that you're able to find a calm even in the midst of a raging storm. There's a story that I've shared with you before, but I feel like that maybe can help someone here this morning, and I want to tell it again. When our oldest son, Dustin, was 17 years old, he was a very outgoing, outspoken, very confident kid. It was about 17 that he received a call for ministry, and he knew where he was headed in life. He knew that God had called him into full-time ministry, and he told everyone, and he was very excited about it. He took a speech class that year, and he knew that he wanted to do that to help kind of hone and sharpen his skills because he'd be speaking for the rest of his life. Very excited about the class. The first speech that he gave, that he was very prepared and walked up and confident, opened his mouth, and all of a sudden there was a severe panic attack that struck him. Not something small, but I'm talking about severe, where it closed him up. He could not catch his breath, could not get a word out. Standing in front of all of his classmates, it was humiliating. It was embarrassing. He went and sat down and was unable to give that speech. As that year went on, he never could stand up in front of that class. He started skipping the class, skipping the days that he was to give the speech, and began to tell me that he'll never stand in front of people, that the calling must have been a mistake, that he was not going into the ministry, that he could not ever be able to stand in front of people. I watched in the next several months that I watched him lose all of his confidence. I watched him start isolating from friends and from us as parents, isolating into his room. And you could see the decline day after day after day, and I felt absolutely hopeless in helping him. There was one night, it was a Friday night that Kay and I had been out to dinner. It was late when we came home, and I opened up the front door and I stepped inside. And it was like something slapped me in the face. It was something that I could sense and something that I could feel. And I'd never experienced anything like that. And I quickly turned to Kay and I said, Kay, do you feel that? It feels like a spirit of fear in our home. I'm telling you, it was frightening. I went to bed that night and I tossed and I turned and we got through the weekend. Now it was Monday morning, and just an average Monday, running around the house, fixing breakfast, making lunches, getting the kids ready for school, and then I realized I'd not seen Dustin. Walked down the hallway, opened up the door, and stepped in, and sitting there in the dark on the edge of his bed, tears streaming down his face, and he was saying, I can't go to school. I can't face today. I cannot do it. And what I saw was deep, deep depression that had attached itself to him. That scene of him sitting on that bed was scary to me. I mean, it frightened me by what I saw, because sitting on that bed was a shell of who he was a few months before. It was everything that I had to get him up that morning and get him off to school, and the moment we did, I grabbed Kay by the hand, and we got in the car and we drove to the church, and we walked into a dark auditorium. We came down, and we laid on the floor, and I started pounding my fist on the floor, fighting in prayer like I had never fought before. And I was fighting for my son. Kay and I, we prayed and we prayed and we prayed, and I would not let up. For 2 hours, we laid on that floor praying. It was after 2 hours, I sat up, and there was such a calm. There was such a peace that came over me. And I turned to Kay and I said, whatever this is and whatever has happened to him, I know this. It's done. It's finished. It's broken. That day, everything changed. When he came home from school, that was the day that everything changed. It wasn't a week later. It wasn't a month later. It was on that day. When we went to fight, or you might say, when the tsunami had hit our home, that we went as deep as we could go. And what I understood was that there was an attack to silence him. There was an attack to silence his future, to silence his purpose. And whenever there is an attack, no matter what it might be, it's when you know that you've got to go deep. And you've got to go to the pathos level, and it's the level of persistent passion that will connect to a living God. David in the Bible, such a fascinating character to me. David was going through a difficult time. Some of you will identify with this. He was being attacked, that people were criticizing him, slandering him. They were lying about him. And in Psalm 109, starting with verse 1, here you see the prayer of David. It says, "O God, my praise, do not be silent, for they have opened the wicked and deceitful mouth against me. They have spoken against me with a lying tongue. They have also surrounded me with words of hatred and fought against me without cause. In return for my love, they act as my accusers, but I am in prayer." But I am in prayer. When the accusations come, when someone slanders you, when someone is lying about you, when someone has so hurt you, but I am in prayer. When you've lost a spouse, you've lost a child, you've lost your business, you've lost your marriage, these 5 words change everything. But I am in prayer. My marriage, you don't understand. It's in shambles. But I am in prayer. You don't understand. I've lost my job, but I am in prayer. My health is failing, but I am in prayer. My child has rebelled. My daughter has rebelled, and I don't know what to do, but I am in prayer. You see, God's ear is tuned to the prayer of pathos. He's tuned to the ear, not of the mediocrity prayer, but the passionate prayer. It's when we are serious with God and understanding He's the answer. He's the only answer.